So good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session on HIV self-testing. My name is Heidi van Rooyen. I'm an Executive Director at the Human Sciences Research Council in South Africa. And it's a pleasure to co-chair the session this morning with Augustine Choko. He's a Wellcome Trust Fellow and one of the pioneers of HIV self-testing in Malawi. So Augustine, happy to do this with you. And welcome to all of you to the session entitled Just Do It Yourself, Preferences and Performances of HIV Self-Testing. I think we give you a wide range of presentations this morning from around the globe, from Zimbabwe, from South Africa, from the UK, from the US, all looking at different ways of assessing, in some cases, feasibility and acceptability of testing, in one case an RCT of self-testing, looking at self-testing online. So interesting and exciting, and we're pleased to hear from our presenters this morning. In terms of our format, that looks like, I'm just watching this guy that's walking up with purpose. Yes, that's our guy. I was just going to tell you, we were going to have 6 presentations. We will have 6 presentations this morning. Welcome. And in terms of how we'd like to proceed with the format for the session, we will take 3 presentations, the presentations only. We'll have questions and discussion after those 3 presentations. I'll then hand over to Augustine, who will do the same for the last 3 presentations. So please hold your questions for your presenters and the presentations you're interested in. We will get to them as soon as we possibly can. So if we may, let's proceed then with our first presentation this morning. Anne Moore from South Africa is going to be talking to us about self-testing and effective means of increasing HIV testing and status awareness. Anne?
Thank you, and good morning. This is a report on an oral self-testing study conducted in South Africa by Médecins Sans Frontières. And as the study actually was completed after the submission of our abstract to IAS, the data has actually changed since then, but the take-home messages remain the same. In keeping with the WHO 1990 goals, this study addresses the first of these goals as we investigated whether offering oral self-testing kits to individuals who refused clinic-based HIV counselling and testing would increase sero-awareness and linkage to care. The study took place in Khayelitsha, South Africa, which is a peri-urban area on the outskirts of Cape Town, about 500,000 inhabitants, of whom 60% live in informal dwellings. The antenatal HIV prevalence in the area is 33%, and we did the study at 2 sites. This study was aimed, as I said, at those clients who declined facility-based HCT at the 2 study sites. They were then offered oral kits to take home to use in the privacy of their own homes. And then we attempted to assess whether they in fact used the tests and whether they subsequently linked to care. In the first clinic, all clients attending the clinic were offered routine HCT. It was actually a screening satellite of a large clinic, and so they were provided with screening for several diseases, including HIV. The other clinic was a large community health center, and so we could not offer HCT to everyone who came in the doors. So health education talks were held in the waiting areas, and people interested in self-testing then came to the study area. All those who attended were first offered facility-based HCT, as we did not want to take away numbers from those. But those who refused to test in the clinic were then offered oral self-testing kits. They then either accepted or refused, depending on how they felt after being informed about the study. The study counselor proceeded to explain the test and how to do it. So they were provided with pictorial instructions on how to do the test at home. It was also emphasized to them that if they were known positive already on ARVs, that they should not do the test because they might get a false negative result. They were then also informed on how to report their test back to the study. So on the other side of the pictorial guide was explanation. If the test kit showed one line, which meant HIV negative, they were asked to SMS back the test one to a toll-free number, and then encouraged to come back to clinic for confirmatory testing, and also advised to retest every 3 months. If the test kit showed 2 lines indicating HIV positive, they were then asked to SMS test 2 back to the toll-free number, and then return to the clinic for confirmatory testing and linkage to HIV care. And all participants were offered information flyers to give to their partners and other friends, but each person who was given a test needed to register for the study, so we did not give several tests to a participant. We used mHealth as part of the follow-up for most of our clients. Their cell phone number was registered in the mHealth database, and they were asked to SMS their results back to the toll-free number. A few of them did not have a cell phone, or they shared a cell phone, and so they were advised to return to clinic to report their result. And all were asked to return for confirmatory HCT. Reminder texts were sent to their cell phones daily for 7 days, reminding them to test, and then also weekly for 3 weeks. And those clients not responding, not reporting their results, were called by phone once a week for 3 weeks in an attempt to encourage them to test and link back to care. We found that 95% of our testers were female. This might have been a bit skewed by the fact that the first clinic was very much a family planning clinic, and so most of the attendees were female. But in the large clinic, there was a mixed population, but males were very reluctant to test. The median age of the testers was 28 years, but age ranged from 18 to 65. In the follow-up phone calls, the counsellor asked them whether they had done the test, whether they felt okay about it, whether they felt depressed or suicidal, and there were no reports of any adverse events when they were phoned. No client made use of the study phone number for queries or assistance, and we hope that this was because the pictorial instructions were clear enough so that they did not need assistance in using it in the privacy of their own homes. This graph shows the results that we found. On the left-hand side, 744 people were offered a self-test, and of these, 88% accepted the self-test. Of those who accepted the self-test, we have a documented result in 73% of them. And of those in whom we have a reported result, 83% reported via the SMS component. So the mHealth side of it was very popular with our clients. Out of the total who accepted the self-test, 7% self-reported themselves positive, and of these, 41% returned within 2 months for confirmation and linkage to care, and that can be compared with those who reported a negative result. Only 9% of them returned to care. So what were their reasons not to take part in the study? They were various, but some were that they didn't want the follow-up of the study. They didn't want to if they wanted to do it in private, then they wanted to keep it private, and so they decided not to test. A few were not ready or scared to test alone, and so they declined the self-test. 34 self-reported a positive result. And it was interesting to note that 50% of them were newly diagnosed positive and 50% were known positives. Of those who were newly diagnosed positive, 71% confirmed their diagnosis, and we know of 33% who've actually gone on to start ARVs. Of interest was those who self-reported negative, because out of 448 who reported negative, on looking at the laboratory database, we found that in fact 21 of them were known positive. But then on looking more closely, 4 of those had been recently diagnosed around the time of the oral testing, and all of those linked to care. So what about the other 17 who were known positive but reported a negative result? And our concern was, were there some who were on ARVs who now have a false negative result and will default from treatment? In follow-up, we found that we were able to follow up just over half, and 9 were known to be in care after self-testing. So our conclusions: oral self-testing increased the proportion of individuals aware of their serostatus, especially those who were negative, defaulters also tested, and also known positive did repeated testing. So it also increased HIV testing coverage and increased linkage to care. There were several defaulters from ARV who, after doing an oral self-test, subsequently linked to care. Males remain a problem group to reach and to link to care, and the mHealth component was effective and acceptable to most participants. So our recommendations are that facility-based, directly assisted oral self-testing represents a viable delivery model to scale up self-testing and to increase HIV testing coverage. Clear pictorial instructions are likely to decrease the need for hotline support. Clear messages must be given about possible false negative results with oral self-testing when on ARVs. SMS technology is a useful tool in assessing HIV self-testing results and linkage to care. But other delivery models are needed to reach target populations like men and youth, and more studies are needed on effective linkage to care. And I'd just like to acknowledge the Western Cape Government, who provided study sites for us, my MSF staff members, and the co-authors. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Anne, for that. We're going to move, if we may, to the next presentation. And the presentation is going to be given by Carrie James from the United Kingdom. He's going to be talking about HIV self-testing, feasibility and acceptability of a large-scale national service delivered by a community organization. Carrie, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that introduction, and it's an honor and a privilege to be here today to talk about this pilot that we were very excited about, and I'm very excited to share it with you. In case you don't know, Terence Higgins Trust is a community-based organization in the UK, and we also deliver projects in Europe and Central Asia. So just very briefly, this is our situation in the UK. So the area of the cascade that we really want to address with this is the first one, to get more people into testing. And of course, it's part of a combination prevention approach that very encouragingly, we've been starting to see real tangible results for. In the last year, in 5 London clinics, we've seen unprecedented decreases in HIV diagnosis amongst MSM, and that's despite an increase in testing, a decrease in the time between diagnosis and when people start treatment, and also more and more MSM accessing PrEP. Even though it's not available on our National Health Service, thousands of gay men are accessing PrEP online and using generics while being supported by sexual health clinics. And the combination of this is believed to have led to this decrease in HIV diagnosis, which ultimately may prove to be a decrease in incidence. And we're also very blessed in the UK to have a very developed HIV testing system. We have free HIV testing through a huge network of sexual health clinics. We have prenatal testing. We have testing in many accident emergency units. We have a very developed and long-established network of community organizations doing peer-to-peer point-of-care testing across the country. And we also have a national home sampling program, which is one of the first in the world and sends out over 40,000 tests per year. But the one segment in testing that we aren't very developed in is self-tests. And I think one reason for this is because they're relatively new. We've only had them for a couple of years. But also I think there's a lot of uncertainty around how community organizations or how public health can best use self-tests. You know, there's a lot of uncertainties that we're not really used to. Like, we don't know if we give people a self-test whether they're going to use them. We don't know if, when they use them, if they get a reactive result, that they're going to link themselves into care. So there's a lot of kind of anxieties. And those are two of the things that we really wanted to address with this pilot. So first of all, we needed a test. And we used the very fine BioSure finger prick blood test, which gives results in 15 minutes. And then we needed to design the service. So we already had experience of remote testing through piloting the National Home Sampling Service and from different kinds of STI testing. So we already had a pretty good idea of what we needed to do. The first thing that we thought was very important was to have a mobile optimized ordering portal. And I'll get back to that, why that was important later. We had very proven channels about how to move these tests, especially amongst MSM. So social media, Facebook in particular, dating apps for gay men, and also our own organic reach as an organization. And one of the big things we wanted to do, we wanted to see if users would tell us their results. So that was made as part of the design. So we asked users to tell us their results, and then we reminded them by an SMS message at day 7 and day 10, if they hadn't already given us the results, to kind of give them a nudge, just said, oh, you know, hello, how are you doing? Have you taken your test? If you have, would you mind telling us your results? And we also had an online customer satisfaction survey, so we could see how people were reacting or how they found the experience of the pilot. So the pilot ran about this time last year. 5,000 kits were sent out. I think we could have probably done 3 times that amount in that time, but that was how much money we had. And at the end of it, over 3,000 people provided us with their results, so over 60%, which we were like really thrilled at. I mean, we didn't really know how many, but I think we would have been, you know, happy with half of that. So I think 62% for our first try was a very good result. About 1% of those were positive, and really importantly, 85% of those had accessed the service via their mobile phone. So that's why when we built the service, it was so important to us that it was very easy to use on the phone to lower those barriers to entry as far as we could. As you can see, we had very good recruitment from all three of our channels, and we had an age just around 32 years of age, which is a good age for us in terms of undiagnosed infection. And the text messages, reminders, really helped. So you can see in this graph, the first bump is when people received the tests, and then some people would do them and then give us the result. And the 2 larger peaks are from when we sent the text messages out. So they were really successful in driving people into giving us their results. And that's kind of behavioral learning that we'll take forward into future pilots. We also asked them to do a behavioral questionnaire as part of the ordering process, just to see who we were sending the tests out to. And 19% of the people that ordered a test had never tested before, and 37% hadn't tested in the last year. So our guidance, our recommendations in the UK is that, you know, gay men should test at least once a year, but really every 3 months, or some clinics offer testing every month if you if you're likely to be exposed to HIV. And if you look at the next three points, I mean, these are men that are very much in need of HIV testing. 81% reported 2 or more partners, 68% reported condomless anal sex in the previous 3 months, with 28% reporting this with 2 or more partners, and 47% reported sometimes having sex under the influence of drink or drugs, with 14% who said it occurred most of the time or always. So these are absolutely the men that we want to be testing, every 3 months, maybe even more often. So this pilot was quite effective in reaching those men and getting them to test. And just looking at the reactive results, so all the reactive results that weren't already known positives or weren't a false positive were contacted by our medical director. So we were able to contact 92%, and all of them had already accessed confirmatory testing and been linked into care. So at least with this group of people in the context of the UK and our healthcare system, there doesn't seem to be any issues around men being able to refer themselves into care if they receive a positive result. So really that kind of lessens a lot of the anxiety that we have that people will not be able to get the care that they need from a self-test. And just finally looking at the user satisfaction survey, we asked people as part of this survey, why did you choose to take a self-test? And 2/3 of them said that because they wanted an immediate result. And we knew from our experience of doing home sampling, so for home sampling we send them the kit, but then they have to send their blood sample off and then they're contacted with their result, that more than half or just about the same percentage said if they were offered a self-test they would prefer that. So this kind of bears out through our experience. And 1/3 said they wanted to use it because there was something about the clinic experience that they didn't like. Either the clinics were not convenient for them to use, or they just didn't want to have a test in person. 98% said they would use the service again, which is terrific user satisfaction numbers. And interestingly for us, on the final one, 57% said that they would be willing to pay for this service. So as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, there aren't a lot of people throwing money at us for us to do extra testing, no matter how much we need it and whatever kind of innovation we have. So we have to try to find new models of sustainable funding. So this kind of idea of a co-payment that people could make a donation, if they can afford it. So, we gave you your test for free. Please donate some money for the next one. Okay. It could be is something that we're really exploring as a future model. So just really quickly in summary, I think we proved that it was a efficient and scalable addition. And that the pilot was reaching a group of MSM who were not testing regularly or at all, that most users would report their results, and we had very high levels of self-referral by reactives. And just in terms of next steps for Terence Higgins Trust, we've actually completed a second pilot using a different self-test just to compare the results and the user satisfaction. And Terence Higgins Trust has made a major commitment to provide a large number of tests in 2018 to help get us to that final 90 before 2020. We also want to do additional pilot promotions with other groups. We know Black Africans especially, we've had good luck reaching them with the internet. We want to make sure that they also benefit from self-testing. We want to really look at developing a sustainable funding model so we can make this available all the time to everyone who would benefit from it. And we want to address some of the remaining barriers for the adoption of these technologies, especially some anxieties around privacy and shared households. Maybe they could order it online and pick it up from a local shop or a pharmacy instead of it coming through their door. So I'd just like to acknowledge my colleagues at Terence Higgins Trust, Public Health England, and BioSure UK, and thanks very much for your time.
Colleagues, we're going to switch over to you for a few minutes. We have about 10 to 12 minutes for questions for our three presenters. If you'd like to just come up to the microphone, you may state your name and where you're from, and then just pose your question. That'll be fantastic. Any takers? Yes. There's someone at the microphone. Let's go with you first, and then the gentleman after you.
Thanks for these very interesting presentations. Self-testing clearly has a lot of great advantages. Some of the potential adverse outcomes with self-testing include coercion, and several studies in China have shown that men coerce other men into being tested. Interestingly, afterwards, it seems like the sort of pressured testing might actually be a good thing, but clearly there needs to be more surveillance of post-self-testing coercion. Have any of these groups thought about this or considered capturing information about coerced testing? Thank you.
Let's take the next question. We'll take 3 questions and then over to our panel.
Hello, my name is Anton Basenko. I'm from Ukraine, Alliance for Public Health. My question is to Kerry James, I think, Terence Higgins Institute presentation. What is the difference between home sampling and self-testing? Because it's home sampling is not self-testing at home?
Okay, great, thank you. And I think in the middle, that's a question as well, please.
Hi, Marianne Chasson from the United States, and I have a question also for the British study. I noticed that 1 out of 28 of the positives was a false positive, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about your concerns around a relatively high false positivity rate. Thank you.
Great, so we'll go over to the panel. If you can all, the 3 of you, just maybe comment on coercion and documenting that in your studies, and then we'll come to you, Kerry, and you've got 2 questions to answer.
I'll go first. For our study, we did ask about coercion. At the end of the study, we've asked questions whether or not they coerced somebody or were coerced. However, at this point in time, I don't have the answer for you, but we have done it.
We also covered that in the pre-test counselling by the counsellor, talked about the possibility of coercion, and also asked in the follow-up phone calls, but never had anything reported to us about coercion. So it could have happened, but we were not aware of it.
And just in terms of those 2 questions, so home sampling, in our definition, is when you give someone a kit, they provide the blood sample, but then they send the blood sample off to the lab, and then the lab gives them the results. And in our case, it's either a text message for a negative result or a phone call if you have a reactive result, and then you're referred into care. So that's a kind of little subtle difference, but I think for a lot of, at least in a lot of men in our study, that seemed like an important difference for them. In terms of the false positive, I mean, I'm not the medical director. I'm really on the other side of the coin and the promotion and the user experience of the service. But I mean, the BioSure test, and I think there are some people from BioSure here, which I'm sure would be very happy to speak to afterwards, has a very high accuracy rate. But unfortunately, I don't have the details of that particular case here. But if you'd like to contact me afterwards, I'd be really happy to connect you with our medical director who can answer that question.
And anything on coercion?
I mean, we haven't had very much experience in the UK context of coercion or reported coercion from the self-tests. Certainly not in the pilots that we've had. I mean, obviously, it's not. Obviously, it's an important issue and it's something that we kind of will look at more as we roll out the service.
Thank you. I think we have time for another round of questions. I see at least a few people. So we'll start on my right-hand side with you. We'll go to the back. And if we have time, the lady who's putting her hand up will come to you as well.
Thank you very much. My name is Mutinta Nalobamba from Society for Family Health in Zambia. My question is to both Carrie and Robin. Your linkage to care was quite high. And both your studies, I believe, were online-based studies. I just wanted to find out what the package of making people link to care looked like. Was it online messages or something more than that? Thank you.
Hi, Catherine Doval from Malawi. This question is for the study in South Africa. You have a remarkably low proportion of men coming for the self-testing. One thing is in other studies in Malawi, surrounding areas, we see that men are actually using the self-test kits. So I wonder if you can talk about if there's something about accessing self-testing in the facility that may be discouraging men, or your thoughts with that.
Great, thank you. Yes, please.
Dr. Jean Thomas from Montreal. I don't know if I feel your results are quite deceiving, Médecins Sans Frontières, because the number of population, HIV false positive, false negative, the low prevalence of HIV in a high-risk population. So my question is about cost effectiveness of this method, because this costs a lot of money, I imagine.
Is that for everyone or just for, was it for you, Kerry? That question.
Was it for South Africa?
Who's that question for? Anyone of the panel? Okay.
Anyone, or Médecins Sans Frontières.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Yes, on my left-hand side.
Good afternoon. I'm Joyce Mwale from Zambia, Japaigo. My question is directed to the presenter from South Africa. As we all know that self-testing to some people could be a challenge, especially in terms of reporting back the results. We've seen that only 7 self-reported that they were HIV positive. Now the question is, how will you be able to deal with such patients in terms of counseling? Because looking at the adherence and retention in care becomes a challenge to such patients. Thank you.
Great, and we will take the last question. Hi, Cheryl.
Cheryl Johnson, WHO. Great presentations. So my question is to Robin. It's great to see these results, really encouraging. I wanted to just, if you could talk a little bit maybe about the linkage to care and specifically what you might think if there's any disaggregation of differences within your study. And then also on, if you could speak to the replacement within the facility-based tests compared to the self-test and talk about why that might be, or if you had some thoughts on that, I'd really appreciate that.
Great, thank you. We're going to hand over to our panel. I think, Anne, you scored a home run now, at least 25 questions for you. So if you can take all 25 in about 3 minutes, and then we'll hand over to Robin and Kerry to talk about linkage to care.
Thank you. Well, you might need to remind me of all the questions.
It was on cost effectiveness, self-reporting of positive results.
And the males.
And then the men.
Yes. Well, let me deal with the males first. As I mentioned, the one clinic that we did the study at was largely women, and so there were very few men there anyway. At the big clinic, there was a higher proportion of men, and in fact, the counsellor went and sat specifically with men in the waiting area to tell them about the study and managed to get more to come and test there. But it was still a very low proportion. Part of the problem being that men actually don't even want to go to the clinic, let alone test for HIV. Of our self-reported positive results, 2 of them were male, and both were lost to follow-up. We managed to contact the one, and he said he would go to another clinic to continue his linkage to care, but he never linked. And the other one gave a fictitious address and a phone number. So they remain a problem which we certainly didn't address in the study. So that's the males then. Cost effectiveness, well, we used the OraQuick test, and that has just come down dramatically in price, which will make a big difference. Yes, it does cost, but it's going to cost the same as HCT. And as we found that multiple testing leads to increased linkage to care, we found some defaulters from ARVs who did the oral self-testing and then subsequently linked to care. So that was part of their process of returning to care, and just providing other means for people to find out or to accept their HIV status, and that often takes a lot of testing, results in more people linking to care. And then
Self-report of positive results.
It was quite low, but it was actually comparable to the HCT results in that area. I mentioned that the antenatal prevalence was 33%, but in fact, the HCT in the one clinic was, the positivity was 7%, and in the other clinic was 11%. So it was similar. It wasn't too different.
Okay, so in terms of linkage to care, with the information that we sent out, we did provide a phone number to our helpline, THT Direct, which would help them if they had any questions about how to use the kit, but also for linkage to care. And again, we're very fortunate. We have, several websites in the UK where you can find a clinic very easily. We have a very developed clinic network and many community organizations that people know and trust. So there's quite a lot of ways that people can find their way into care. From those 22, we didn't monitor actually. We didn't ask them how they actually link themselves into care, but I think for future pilots, that's definitely something that we should be looking at and monitoring.
Okay, for linkage to care in the ESAMP study, every time somebody reported a positive result, either a preliminary positive or a positive diagnosis, we had someone from the Emory University contact them. And that's how we were able to find out whether or not they were actually linked to care. Now, some people either disconnected their phones, stopped answering emails, or stopped answering the text messages, but we made extensive efforts to contact every single person, and we continued as long as we possibly could, up until about 6 attempts, and then we felt that was enough. So, and Cheryl, what was your question about the facilities?
So I was really interested in your point where you were showing that there was lower facility-based testing for the self-testers. So I just wanted you to kind of talk about that, because when we talk about self-testing, we're like, is it going to have a replacement effect? What would that look like? And I just wanted your reflections on that as you look at your data of what you're kind of thinking. And I also had a question on the linkage to care for the 70% to say, did you have any disaggregation of what was happening
Cheryl
there?
is taking advantage of the microphone.
Yeah,
so
right.
I think just talk about the facility.
I'll talk about the facility testing. There may have been a slight difference in maybe replacing some tests with self-testing, but they're testing so much more often, there may not be a need to go to a clinic as frequently. Certainly, they ended up finding more cases of HIV in that arm during the study period. So they were testing more often and sooner or later being diagnosed and reporting it to us. So I don't think there doesn't seem to be harm in a little bit less testing at a clinic. And that is overall within those two populations, it was about 40% to 60-something%. So, enough.
Thank you very much. So our 3 second half presenters are anxiously waiting. So over to you, Augustine, and to the 3 of them. Thank you to the 3 of you.
Thank you very much, Haid. I think I'm really excited already with what's been presented. Without much ado, we're going to have Sue Mavizenge to present some exciting data from Zimbabwe. Feasibility of HIV self-test programming among female sex workers in Zimbabwe. Sue.
Good morning. Thanks very much for the introduction, Agu. It's a pleasure to be presenting this work on behalf of my co-authors. Female sex workers in Zimbabwe, as elsewhere in Africa, are disproportionately burdened by HIV. HIV prevalence among sex workers in Zimbabwe ranges between 50% and 70% as compared to 14% in the general population. Despite this disproportionate burden, engagement in HIV services doesn't reflect this heightened risk. Knowledge of HIV status represents the biggest drop in the HIV care cascade among sex workers in Zimbabwe and is a first step towards accessing onward HIV services. I think I'm preaching to the choir here when I say that closing this testing gap is a critical first step. And just because I see Francis in the room, this cascade data was from 2013, and it is much improved now with, I think, awareness of HIV status between 75 and 80%, but it still remains the biggest drop. So HIV self-testing may be particularly appropriate for sex workers due to their high knowledge of HIV and the need for frequent retesting. And although there is little research among self-testing and sex workers, I see that a lot more is emerging recently. We conducted preliminary research to assess accuracy of self-testing among sex workers in Zimbabwe through supervised self-testing using instructions that were validated in the general population. And the results are shown in the table here, and as you can see, accuracy was excellent. So the work I'm presenting today is an extension of this accuracy research. We offered self-testing for 6 months to women at a dedicated sex work clinic in the capital city of Harare, Zimbabwe, to evaluate programmatic feasibility. Adult female sex workers of unknown HIV status who had presented at the clinic for HIV testing were given the option of either provider-delivered or HIV self-testing. Those opting for self-testing were invited to enroll, and participants received the self-test kit along with the instructions that had been validated in our previous research. And they were contacted after approximately 2 weeks to complete a questionnaire about their experience. So the results, in terms of self-testing uptake and use, a total of 607 women presented for testing at the clinic, and 54% opted for self-testing. They all used the self-test kit, and 96% of those women tested at the clinic site. Of the 12 that tested off-site, 4 tested with someone else present, and they all reported that the self-test wasn't hard to use. In terms of baseline characteristics of those who self-tested, just to give you an idea of what this population looked like, the mean age was 29 years, but we had a wide age range of 18 to 62 years. Food insecurity was quite high in this population, even though it was an urban capital city. 94% had previously tested for HIV, and about half of women generated all of their income through sex work. In terms of the self-test results and linkage, 30% had a reactive test result, and they all trusted that their test was correct, and nearly everyone was comfortable learning their test result without a provider present. Importantly, among those who did have a reactive test, virtually everyone sought post-test services by the time of follow-up. In terms of acceptability, I mean, the take-home message here is really that self-testing was highly acceptable. 100% of those who had a negative test said they would test again. Though most tested in the clinic, nearly all reported that the next time they would test, the next time they self-tested, they would like to test at home. And almost half of the women said they would test with someone else present the next time. All said they would recommend self-testing to family and friends, and over 80% said they would recommend self-testing to a client. We asked women if self-testing were for sale, how much they would be willing to pay for a test kit. All reported that they would be willing to purchase a test, with most willing to pay between 50 cents and $5 US. So we also collected some qualitative data from women around implementation of self-test programming. 5% of sex workers reported that they had some concerns about making self-testing widely available. These concerns were primarily fear of a positive result, and also some were concerned around the difficulty in performing the test or interpreting the results. But we also asked them about suggestions to mitigate these concerns. And they suggested making a demonstration video available, providing education about how to perform the test, and making counseling available. But they also indicated that women just needed to get used to self-testing. We specifically asked if women thought that coercion or forced testing was a possibility, and 38% reported that they thought it was. Their suggestions to mitigate this concern was to include teaching about the importance of consent to test, to teach others, such as spouses and employers, not to force testing, and also to teach negotiating skills. Female sex workers thought that self-testing programs should be promoted via mass media, pamphlets, flyers, and posters at beer halls where they work and at clinics. They thought it should be via peer-to-peer and outreach education, and also to inform women who are coming to clinics about the availability of self-testing. And finally, we asked them how they thought self-test kits should be distributed, and they could report more than one answer. The majority said that they thought they should be available at the clinic, but a good proportion also said they should be made available at pharmacies, from peers, and at their workplaces. In terms of next steps, we've now scaled up self-test distribution at 6 dedicated sex worker clinics and 12 outreach sites. We're preparing to begin community distribution of self-test kits. And soon, sex workers will also be able to take up to 3 additional test kits home with them to test their partners. We've also conducted some additional focus group discussions around self-test programming for sex workers. And I encourage you all to attend the poster discussion on this work presented on Wednesday, and I have the poster number there. We have been concerned that we still may be missing a segment of the population of sex workers who don't regularly attend clinic services, and this indeed did emerge in our focus group work. Therefore, we're also considering what additional strategies we can employ to try and reach these women. And in terms of conclusions, sex workers found self-testing highly acceptable. They wanted it to be available to them, and they expressed a willingness to pay for these test kits. With the caveat that this was in the capital city. With our focus group discussions, we have seen in more rural populations less willingness to pay for test kits. A high proportion of women had a reactive self-test, but virtually everyone had linked to post-test services by the time of follow-up. A minority of women expressed concerns around self-testing, but they also provided us with reasonable suggestions for mediation. And in our work, we are carefully monitoring adverse events. Women also provided useful insight into how to distribute and promote self-test kits, and we have begun implementing some of these suggestions. And then just to conclude, our research has demonstrated that self-testing really represents a very promising strategy to promote regular retesting among sex workers in Zimbabwe. And I'd just like to acknowledge all of the sex workers that participated in this research and other self-testing research that we've been conducting. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors who are listed here, and also for their financial support, RTI International, the Department for International Development, and Unitaid. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue. Remaining within the theme of female sex workers and the impact of self-testing, we are now going to hear from Catherine, who is going to present some exciting data from a class randomized trial in Zambia.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. I am really thrilled to be presenting the results of a randomized controlled trial that we conducted in Zambia with female sex workers. I have no disclosures. So in 2016, the World Health Organization guidelines recommended that HIV self-testing be offered in addition to standard testing services. And specifically, these guidelines included language related to key populations. For female sex workers, HIV self-testing may be particularly helpful to address multi-level barriers for testing, which include provider stigma, inconvenient clinic hours, and those sorts of things. However, the development of effective delivery approaches is really essential, particularly for populations, and strategies that work for the general population may not work for female sex workers. We conducted a 3-arm cluster randomized trial, the Zambian Peer Educators for HIV Self-Testing, or affectionately ZEST study. This study was conducted with peer educators who we used, where we worked with for outreach to female sex worker participants. We recruited 160 peer educators who completed a 2-day training, and each of those peer educators recruited 6 female sex worker participants. The peer educator and participant groups of 1 peer educator and 6 participants were randomized into one of 3 arms. They were randomized to a standard of care arm where all participants received condoms, HIV and IPV, intimate partner violence counseling, referral to standard available testing services, and access to a 24/7 hotline that they could call with any concerns. The two HIV self-testing arms included a direct delivery arm where the peer educator directly gave an oral HIV self-testing kit to each participant, in addition to all of the activities that were conducted in the standard of care arm. The second HIV self-testing arm was a coupon distribution, where the peer educator gave a coupon to the participants that they could use to collect an HIV self-testing kit at a participating pharmacy or drugstore or health clinic. And in both of the HIV self-testing arms, participants received 2 self-testing kits. One was at baseline at the first peer educator visit, and the second was at 3 months. And the purpose of that was to measure whether female sex workers would use the self-test kit again a second time for repeat testing. The study was conducted in 3 sites in Zambia, all of which are transit zones. So 2 were on the border with Zimbabwe, in Chirundu and Livingston. And the third was Kapiri and Poshi, which is a major trucking route up to the north. And the photos on the right are photos of the study sites in Livingston. The inclusion criteria for participants in the study was that they were 18 years of age or older at the time of enrollment. Our sex work definition was that they had exchanged sex at least once in exchange for money or goods in the past month. Women were self-reported to be HIV negative or they didn't know their status, and we excluded women who had recently tested within the past 3 months for HIV. And finally, because we were concerned about mobility, we enrolled women who reported that their primary residence was in one of our study towns. Participants completed 3 questionnaires with research assistants at baseline and then 1 and 4 months. So our follow-up questionnaires were approximately 1 month after they had gotten each of the HIV self-tests or had met with their peer educator if they were in the standard of care arm. And our primary outcome was the past 1 month HIV testing at the 1 month visit. We also measured past 1 month HIV testing at the 4 month visit, and we measured HIV self-test use in the self-testing arms. We linkage to care and ART initiation, and we carefully monitored for adverse events throughout the course of the study through screening by the research assistants, screening by the peer educators, and via the hotline. This is a flow diagram of women who were included in the study. Approximately 1,300 women were screened, and of those, 965 were enrolled in the trial. And we had pretty great follow-up. It was higher than we anticipated. It was about 92% at 1 month and 93% at 4 months. This table shows the baseline characteristics. The median age was 25, and that was consistent across all arms. About twice as many women were enrolled in Livingston as compared to Kapiri and Chirundu, which is reflective of the size of the populations in those towns. Most women had at least a primary education. And about 60% of the women had tested for HIV in the past 12 months. And of note, 20% of women had never tested for HIV. So they told us they had never had an HIV test. So we were reaching women who were not accessing traditional and available HIV testing services. Intimate partner violence, this is physical and or sexual, was quite high. And it was something we really paid attention to throughout the course of the study, with about 60% of women reporting intimate partner violence in the last 12 months. Overall, past 1 month HIV testing at both 1 and 4 months was quite high. This figure shows on the left past 1 month testing at the 1 month visit and at the 4 month visit on the right. In the standard of care arm, which is the black bar, HIV testing was 89%. 89% of women reported that they tested for HIV in the past month at 1 month and 75% at 4 months. In the direct delivery arm, so the arm where the peer educator directly handed the coupon or handed the test to the woman, 95% of women at 1 month and 84% at 4 months reported testing for HIV. And in the coupon arm, it was 84% at 1 month and 80% at 4 months. There was no significant difference in either the direct delivery or the coupon arm compared to standard of care in terms of HIV testing at either 1 or 4 months. Women who were directly given an HIV self-test, were more likely to test for HIV compared to women who were given a coupon at 1 month, but this difference was gone by the 4-month visit. In terms of HIV self-test kit use, this is just among the HIV self-testing arms. So as was reflected in the HIV testing coverage overall, women were more likely at 1 month to report using the HIV self-test if they were given it directly than if they were given a coupon and asked to pick the test up at a facility. And about 98% of women reported that they used the test at 1 month if they were given it directly, and 90% at 4 months, compared to 86% at 1 month and 89% at 4 months in the coupon arm. 144 women at 1 month and 235 women at 4 months reported that they had a positive HIV test in the 3 arms overall. Linkage to care was higher at both study time points in the standard of care arm compared to the HIV self-testing arms, with 75% of women reporting that they linked to care and about 47% of women reporting that they'd started ART at 1 month, compared to about 50% linking to care and about 25% linking to care in the self-testing arms. These numbers went up across all arms by the 4-month visit, and none of these differences were statistically significant, although we were not powered to detect differences in linkage to care or ART initiation. We had 3 reports of intimate partner violence directly related to HIV self-testing over the course of the study. They were, in general, incidents where a partner had found out that the woman had tested for HIV and resulted in a physical assault. We had no other reports of adverse events. Specifically, we did not have any reports of coercive testing or psychosocial distress. In terms of limitations, I think this may be the very best kind of limitation to have. Overall, HIV testing was extraordinarily high. So across the entire study, there was 1 woman over the 4-month period who did not test for HIV. However, that makes it very difficult to see differences across study arms. As with most HIV self-testing studies, our outcomes are self-reported, and so the limitations that are inherent in that are inherent in the study as well. And finally, our participants were followed only for 4 months, and so our linkage to care and ART initiation outcomes increased substantially by the 4-month visit, but it would be interesting to see what happens at 6 months and 12 months, whether these differences go away. So in summary, HIV self-testing was highly used by participants, but it did not increase HIV testing rates relative to the standard of care. Facility-based delivery was acceptable, and people used the self-test kits, and they picked them up, but it might lead to slower rollout. HIV self-testing did not seem to lead to elevated rates of intimate partner violence, considering the extraordinarily high background rates. However, this is an area to pay attention to as HIV self-testing is rolled out. So in conclusion, HIV self-testing is acceptable, it's accessible, and it's safe for female sex workers in Zambia. The uptake of HIV self-testing may be slower with facility-based delivery, but people will do it. And linkage to care may be delayed following HIV self-testing, so we may need to develop interventions following self-testing to encourage people to link to care, but more work is needed there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and I hope you are noting down the questions soon after the last presenter. Now I would like to welcome Matiru Mwau, who is going to present to us performance and usability of the INSTI, a blood-based rapid HIV self-test for qualitative detection of HIV antibodies in intended use populations in Kenya.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. It's my pleasure to be here. I'd like to start by disclosing that historically our evaluations of HIV point-of-care tests have been supported by United, but this particular study on INSTI came after the end of that support, so we received consumables and the tests and so on from INSTI. But in all fairness, I brought myself here. I was not brought by INSTI. My name is Matilu Mwau, and I'm going to tell you about the performance and usability of INSTI, which we hope to use in populations that would actually benefit from this kind of facility. You might know that Kenya is a country in East Africa, obviously, and also the fact that we have been speaking in Kenya about the possibility of HIV self-testing for several years. And some of the challenges that have been on the table have been the fact that, number one, it is conceivable that a person can test themselves and then they are unpleasantly surprised by the outcome and then they harm themselves. And the second thing for us has been the fact that when you test yourself, you need to link yourself to care or to treatment, and that is a challenge for our country. And the third thing would be the technical challenges around testing yourself, especially because a lot of our populations are not that literate, with some literacy rates in some places falling below 50%. And of course, then there are the issues of cost and the fact that many products, there have not been very many products that you can use for self-testing available in our part of the world. Regardless, around this year, or actually from around a year ago, but the discussion has been going on, but around this year, self-testing became one of those things that are available in the public space in terms of discussion, and the government launched a program called Be Self-Sure, so that people could actually be able to test themselves. But even when that program was launched, the products on the table are not very many. Now, part of our business has been to evaluate products of all kinds that can help our people with regard to HIV, and especially because, as you might know, in a population of 45 million, I would assume maybe 10 to 20 million Kenyans have never even seen an HIV test. For this particular study, our objectives were very straightforward. The first one was to look at the performance characteristics, and the other part of the study was to look at the usability in the normal hands out in the field, and the third thing was to look at readability of the results, whether people, for instance, are able to understand that a faint line means you are HIV positive. The INSI test for self-testing is more or less similar to the INSI test that you are familiar with that is used by professionals. And the only thing I would like to say here is that in the self-test, you use the 50 microliters of free-flowing blood after pricking yourself. Is a blood test. And then the professional use has reported performance of 100% sensitivity and specificity. The testing itself from the individual is more or less the same as what you do as a professional, and that is quite, many people here are probably familiar with that kind of testing. We did this study in Western Kenya. The prevalence of HIV in Western Kenya is slightly, or not slightly, significantly higher than in other parts of the country, and we have good relationships that we've established over the years with regard to evaluating technologies, and the Kenya Medical Research Institute, which I work for, has a strong presence there, and this study was completed in April this year. We looked at 688 participants who got consent, and some consented for the finger stick only, some consented for both the finger stick and the label comprehension, and others consulted for the results interpretation study. 200 of those participants were non-HIV positive, right? And all of them were adults, and we observed the process of testing themselves, and then we looked at the results after they had tested themselves and recorded it ourselves as the healthcare workers. The first thing that we looked at was accuracy, and I would like to say that the sensitivity in those hands of people out there in the field, the intended users, the accuracy was 98.5%, and the with the sensitivity, the accuracy with the sensitivity of 98.5%, sorry, and the specificity of 99.26%. For us in our country, this is very high specificity and sensitivity, especially in non-professional hands. We also looked at the usability. Quite often when you take a product out there, it might perform very well, but then you find that it doesn't help the people. We looked at how people are looking at how people are pricking themselves, what they were doing with the waste that they were generating, and whether they were diluting the blood properly, and whether they were completing all the procedures properly. And I would like to report that the lowest usability was probably with the use of the lancet. People in my part of the world are probably scared of injuries. I mean, the lancet is not so bad, but it's a prick, and blood also has cultural issues, but with more than 80% usability there. All the other processes had usability exceeding 90%. But for the lancet, several of our study participants needed to be supported to prick themselves appropriately. The only surprising thing there about Lancet is that our people are farmers in that part of the world. Their hands sometimes are fairly tough, calloused, but the Lancets that we had available were able to draw blood, right? Then we looked at acceptability, and we went on to ask questions, including whether, how much even people would be willing to pay for this test. It was made available to them. The instructions were simple, pictorial, easy to use. People reported in that acceptability exceeding 90% for various components of that study. With regard to readability, and you know, the INSTI test gives you dots, 2 dots bad, 1 dot good, depending on where the 1 dot is. And the dot can be faint or can be clear. And whenever there was a clear dot, the readability was very good, 100%. But when there was a weak dot, people found it difficult to interpret that dot to see whether they are positive or negative. Now, the truth of the matter is that when there is a weak dot, you are positive. And that's one of the areas where we think when we are providing information to our people, if we are to make this available, they need to understand how to interpret that weak dot, right? In terms of conclusion, I can say that the performance of INSTI in the lay hands out in the field has been very good for us, with a positive predictive value of 89.3%. And the reason for that, of course, is that our prevalence now for HIV has dropped from what you used to know as 14%, 12%, 7%. Now it's around 5.4% actually, the last time I checked, right? And that has implications with regard to what you use out there in the field. And this performance meets the Ministry of Health threshold for tests of this nature. The overall label comprehension is very high, 96% or 97%. One of the characteristics of our study is that more males participated than females. I want to mention this because in our normal studies, females are more likely to participate than males. But in this case, we didn't work in the health facilities, we worked out in the villages, and we used the existing systems to bring people like to the marketplaces and so on, and men tend to like that very much. So we were quite happy with that. I want to just remind you that the poor interpretation for the weak positive report is something to think about. Of course, I don't work alone. I have my foot soldiers. We came with them here, and I work for the Kenya Medical Research Institute. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank the 3 presenters for sticking to time. And I think it's now the opportunity to interact with them by asking questions that you may have had. Yes, I see there is a question at the back.
Hi, sorry, I'm Hendy, I'm from Warwick in Malawi. It's a question for Catherine. So when you did the trial, you powered your sample for testing within the last month. Had you considered other kind of power calculations, especially, for example, linkage to care? Because as Sue's slide shows, is that the testing cascade is going to be high at the testing uptake, but it's the linkage that is an issue. Thanks.
All right. The next question.
Hi, Roger Pepperdy from AIDSmap. It's a question for Sue. I'm just interested in the women testing in the clinic, and could you tell us a bit more about that? Was it tending to be with the counsellor present, or going off to a private room and then coming back to check any difficulties? Or anything? Just give us a bit more of a picture of that, please.
And can we take the last one for this round?
Hi, I'm Nikki Pai, McGill University. I have two questions. One to the INSTI study, whether literacy plays a role in interpreting findings of a self-test result. That's question 1. And question 2, in terms of interpretation of self-tests, there are nuances. So invalids are often deleted when we publish papers. Could someone advise me as to how, if we include the results of the invalids, how would the results be different? Thank you.
So up to the panelists.
I can answer. So for about our power calculation for the ZEST study, so yes, the ZEST study was powered on our primary outcome, which was testing in the last month. We did not power on linkage to care or ART initiation, partially because we didn't really have a good sense for how many women would actually self-report a positive test. I will say that for the linkage to care outcome at 1 month, in a non-pre-specified kind of post hoc analysis, we pooled the two HIV self-testing arms since there was really no difference in linkage to care there, and there was a statistically significant decrease in linkage to care in those pooled arms compared to the standard of care arm. But as you can see at 4 months, really the linkage to care is going up over time. And so, I mean, in short, in answer to the question, we did not power on linkage to care or ART. We sort of thought about it, but we also were under the constraints of time and resources. And so we powered on our primary outcome.
Thank you. Shall we have Sue?
Yeah, so I'll just quickly answer the question about women who opted to self-test but tested themselves at the clinic facility. We provided a private room for them to test in, but this was somewhat of a surprising result that so many women wanted to test at the clinic, and I think in programming it's important to keep that in mind, and that self-testing means many different things, but making a space available right there is something that people might like to do, and it also facilitates linkage to care.
And our last panelist, actually that is a question that I also had regarding the study participants. It seems like they were all able to read and write. And in terms of how we can generalize, self-testing to populations, I mean, with the results that you had, I think that's a good question. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts about that.
First of all, I would like to say that about 50, when I checked, about 50-something% had either primary level education or no education at all. At least a third had no education at all, if I remember correctly. So that did not affect the ability to interpret a good result. But and also, people who are well educated and those who are not well educated all had similar difficulties reporting a faint result, no significant difference. And that has something to do perhaps with the fact that we didn't explain nicely what that is, and it's not normally said out there that sometimes you can get faint results. So that was an issue for us. So the second thing has to do with invalids. We did not design our study to do much more on the invalids. We had 6 invalid tests, but outside of the study, we looked at those invalids just by repeating them, and they had concordance with the normal comparator test. So that would make it look a bit nicer than it was, actually. To make it look nicer if we reported those invalid results. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can we take another 3 questions? Shall we start with there?
Hi. So I've got just a comment about the very nice Kenyan study. I wonder also how much poor eyesight plays an issue. If you're in a hut with no electricity and you haven't got glasses, if you don't see very well, seeing the difference between a not good test, a faint positive and a negative result might be quite difficult. But the question I had was for Catherine and related to what the services for sex workers were like. Were the peer educators recruited just for this study, or were they sex work peer educators who were doing more programming? And were people being referred to specific sex work services, or were they being referred just into the usual services which they hadn't felt comfortable to go to before?
Thank you very much, and we'll take...
First of all, congratulations everyone on their presentation, really great. Carmen Figueroa from WHO. I have 2 questions. One for Catherine, where I saw your inclusion criteria was above 18 years old, but then in the study you had like 21 women. Can you say something about young female sex workers? Because, we need to know and understand young people's. Did they had more social harm? How they perform the test? And my second question is for Matilu. Well, it's actually 2 questions. What were you comparing the results to, both in the accuracy and in the readability part of the study? And then were participants interpreting their own results, or they were interpreting mock-up results? Thanks.
We'll take the last question. For this round?
The question is for Matur about Kenyan study. What is the storage condition of the test kits that you use? The studies that you are using in very high temperature areas, and most of these rapid tests or home tests are under, kind of cold storage conditions. So how are they maintained and used?
Some thoughts from the panelists? Shall we start? You're getting a lot of stick.
Okay. Okay, so I'll start with services for the participants in our study. So the peer educators were, some of them had participated previously in peer educator trainings and worked as peer educators via sex worker organizations in Zambia. And some of them were new peer educators, and this was kind of their first time in that role. They completed a two-day training which focused on HIV prevention and HIV testing and HIV self-testing, and they all had the opportunity to use one of the oral HIV self-test kits. We did do some work with providers in each of our study communities related to kind of being responsive and reflective of sex worker needs. Specifically, the facilities that the sex workers kind of overwhelmingly preferred to test at had closed at the time of our study. So there'd been a project called Corridors of Hope, which was not operational. But we did spend some time working with the existing services to make sure that they would not turn our participants away and that kind of thing. So there was some work done in terms of sensitization. And then I can also talk, while I'm at it, I can talk about the inclusion criteria with the young sex workers. It's a great question. We spent actually quite a bit of time debating whether or not we should include participants who are less than 18 years of age, and ultimately we decided not to do it because it's complicated. In terms of research ethics and that kind of thing. I think it's an incredibly important population, those who are less than 18, and certainly when we asked women at what age they started sex work, a lot of them it was 15, 16 years. So there are definitely women in that age group, and I think research needs to be done there. We haven't actually looked at the data disaggregated by age, and I think that's a great next step for us to look at kind of if there are differences in our outcomes by age group.
Thank you. Can we have some thoughts?
Thank you very much. I would like to start with the simplest one, the storage conditions. The room temperature in Busia in Western Kenya is usually somewhere between 22 and 32 Celsius, which is slightly better than in Paris during summer. The trouble begins when you begin to transport these things from Nairobi, for instance, 400 or 500 kilometers in the back of a truck. And the back of the truck is not refrigerated, it's just a normal truck that's closed, and sometimes the temperatures in those sorts of conditions can rise to 50 Celsius. Now, that's a problem. And this is the reason why we want to be doing post-market looks at our surveillance for these sorts of things, so that they do not give our people misleading information. But this was not part of this study, but it's something that we pay attention to. With regard to what we compared with, the comparator was the BioELISA from BioKit. It's an ELISA test from BioKit. And with regard to readability, we received various grades of tests that were prepared by the manufacturer with various brightnesses of the spots, right? They are contrived by the manufacturer. And so we had the manufacturer's opinion about what they had prepared. And of course, myself as the health worker, I looked at what I thought it was, which was concordant with the manufacturer. And then I allowed the participants to determine what they thought those spots were. So that's how we did readability, all right? Then, with regard to interpreting the results, for readability, the result that we took was the result of the manufacturer and the result of the participant, right? And then with regard to performance of this test, the accuracy, the result we took was the healthcare worker result and the healthcare worker result, that is the BioELISA versus the test itself, right? And I also want to tell you that the result that we gave to the client was none of these that I've mentioned. The client at the same time also did the normal national algorithm test. That's the result that we gave to the client, right? And the people who are supposed to provide linkage and care were in that environment waiting to take up and do their work. So that's how the study was organized. The last thing is about eyesight. I'm curious about that because also in our part of the world, color blindness is a big deal, just apart from poor eyesight and poor lighting. But we did not design the study to. We just said, okay, let people look at it and see. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We'll now take the last three. Can we start with the lady at the back, please?
Okay, good morning, Dr. Bianson from the Philippines Department of Health. Thank you to all the presenters. My question goes to the last presenter. When you mentioned that there were reports of invalid tests, my understanding is that these are doubtful results. So in that event, how then did you eliminate the doubtfulness? Was a repeat test done, and should there been a repeat test, what will be how the discordance was resolved? And if it turns out to be positive or negative, will it still be counted as positive or negative, or it was just merely considered the first result of being invalid? Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll take the gentleman in front.
Muhammad Jamil from the Kirby Institute in Sydney. My question is about the eStamp project. I was wondering if you looked at STI testing frequency in the study arms, and if you could maybe also clarify if HIV testing frequency outcome included facility-based testing in the intervention arm. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then we'll end with the two gentlemen in the middle. They've been standing for a long time, and then we'll close from there.
Thank you for noticing. Russell Dackham, Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. This is a question for the Kenyan presentation. What support did participants, if any, get before and during performing the test? Because they're great accuracy results. It would be nice to see what support they were given, if any.
Elliot Cowan with Partners in Diagnostics and also working with the STAR program in Liverpool. A question about the weak positives. For Matilu and also for any of the panelists, what is the frequency with which you see a clinical specimen with a weak positive? My understanding is that that would be a very rare event. I know it's something that we need to be concerned about, the ability of people to read weak positives. But in actual clinical use, what have you seen? Because I would expect that a weak positive would only occur in someone who is seroconverting, and the likelihood of finding someone like that is going to be relatively rare. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I could ask the panelists to be very brief in their responses because of time.
Thank you. Maybe I should just start and say the invalid is the dot in the wrong place kind of concept, and we, of course, did not include those results in our analysis, but behind the scenes we went back and repeated, and then we also looked at the bioELISA to determine what they want. There was concordance. But out there in the field, it is conceivable that when this becomes publicly available, invalid results could be an issue. So the insert is going to tell you what you should do when you see this kind of thing, and generally that is going to the health facility to have this resolved. Okay? So with regard to the support that we are providing, when we were doing the study, we were with the people from the National Public Health System, waiting there and giving counseling and stuff like that. But in real life, when this becomes available, then of course there'll be a telephone number or an SMS to send to contact to report yourself and what you found, and then you can be taken up from there. All right. Then with regard to weak positives, I would like to say that very, very uncommon. However, if we are using this in areas of high prevalence, for instance, like in Homa Bay, it is possible to find significant numbers of weak positives, and it's important for us to be prepared for that kind of eventuality. So it's something we need to think about carefully. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Were there any other questions for the other panelists?
Okay, related to STD testing and eStamp, we did not ask questions about STD testing within the population. Concerning the question about facility-based testing, we asked them where they got their last HIV test, and that's how we determined whether or not it was at a facility. And one of the slides had, I think the mean number of tests in the intervention group was 0.9, and the mean facility-based testing in the control group was 1.5. So hopefully that answers your question.
And Sue has some thoughts.
I was just going to address your question on weak positives, Elliot. We did in our supervised self-testing in the general population, it was indeed very rare, the weak positives. It was about 1%. But just to note that it can also occur on someone self-testing who is on ARV.
So with that, I would like to thank you for still being here and listening to these wonderful presentations and thoughts. And just to thank my co-chair, Haid, and all the panelists for wonderful presentations. I would like to ask you to give a round of applause to our panelists.